Chapter 26, Episode 8. Zara was trying to be poetic as she strolled along the river. She formed a few haikus, then went on to limericks. Then she started paying attention to her surroundings. Not her natural habitat. The four girls had decided on a canoe trip in Algonquin Park. Zara lived in a little rainforest, but the family dining room was in the same home. Here there were bears and wolves lurking about. Artemis assured everyone that if they weren't careless, they would attract no bears. They might have to wait for a moose or chase birds away from their food. Hang everything edible to keep raccoons from ripping through the tents. They were near as dangerous as bears because they were less offended by the smell of humans. Zara stood still and took note of things. She knew there were 3 girls nearby. She heard many birds and insects. She saw the particles of dust floating by. She watched how the treetops moved in a slow waving motion. When she looked back at the river, she was a little surprised to see Artemis standing naked but for her knife belt and the knives. Artemis fascinated her. She was so still and gentle that she was almost invisible, the real hunter. Zara smiled. She had only ever hunted farm animals in their cages. Zara wondered how close she could get to Artemis before Artemis would hear her. She didn't know that Artemis could hear the sounds that changed when a human walked among other creatures. The birds told her. The insects whispered. The gentle breeze bent around Zara's body. Even downwind, Zara had been detected. Artemis had her eyes on breakfast. She had carved a nice fishing spear at the campfire the night before. She knew Zara was a fussy eater, in many ways like a rabbit, except that she liked raw fish. Artemis didn't suspect Zara ate people. It wasn't something most people would normally consider of someone capable of intelligent conversation and personal contact. The spear drove into the water so fast that the fish's brain hadn't had time to register the movement before it felt the shock that was pain for a few moments until it surrendered its life. Artemis had heard Zara trying not to be heard as she moved behind a tree. She understood that she was playing a game with her. Artemis threw the fish and spear onto the shore and slid under the water and disappeared among some reeds. She brought her head above the surface shortly to listen for the intruder. The intruder was not a forest child like Artemis. She wasn't aware of the soft sounds of leaves underfoot or the crunching of grass, sounds barely audible for most humans but more than enough to alert forest creatures. Artemis didn't know the language of birds. No one really did, but she knew when they changed their tune. Zara stood beside a tree in the shadow and looked around. She had heard the fish and spear hit the ground, and now she could see them. There was no other sign that Artemis was in the near. She knew she couldn't have vanished into thin air. That kind of shit just don't happen. She watched the river to see if Artemis might pop up somewhere. Maybe she had gone for a morning swim. It didn't occur to Zara that Artemis had heard the stalker. Zara walked downstream thinking it was the only way Artemis could have gone. She wondered if she might have gone off into the woods for a shit, but there was no indication that she had left the water. She stood now well in the open looking across the river up and down the bank. A gentle breeze rustled the reeds in front of her. A little bird seemed to be talking to her while it balanced with its wings on a reed that bent to its weight. Zara thought she felt something crawling up her leg and bent to brush it away. In the moment that she bent, she saw her mistake. It wasn't her reflection she saw in the water. It was a wild beast that sprang out of the water, took a great gulp of air, and pulled Zara under. Zara was shocked, not so much at what was happening, but that she had been had. No one had ever managed to catch her off guard or off balance before. She knew she was not in danger, so did not fight to kill. Artemis held her under and wrapped her arms and legs around her. Artemis managed to have one arm free. She used it to take hold of Zara's head and forced it toward her own. If Artemis had been the enemy, Zara would have bit her. Artemis pulled her mouth around Sarah's and pinched her face to get her mouth open so she could share the extra air she had drawn into her lungs. Zara relaxed and breathed slowly with Artemis for what seemed like forever. The next thing she knew was she was lying beside a fish and waking up from a nap in the sun. She took the fish and returned to camp.